Brilliance Audio presents Trial by Treason by Dave Duncan, performed by Tim Campbell. Near the end of summer, in the middle of a day, a cavalcade of horsemen came thundering through the forests and over the landscape in the centre of England. Although they wore no armour, sunlight flashed off the sword hilts at their belts and their conical helmets. They rode war horses, and one of the two men in the lead carried a staff, from which flew a coloured pennant. The squires at the rear led sumpters encumbered with packs and also barrels that held the knight's chainmail, loaded in sand to keep it burnished and shiny. This caravan frightened the livestock and alarmed the peasants cutting barley in the fields, although I admit their leader was always careful to avoid crops as much as he could. There are no highways near Helmden, only tracks, and shortcuts will always tempt men in a hurry. I had expected them to come from the south, but they had failed to find the shortest route, and so they entered the village from the north. I am sure that Helmden did not impress them. A dozen or so cob-and-thatch cottages flanking the road, a public well, a tract of common land, and some majestic elm trees. It even lacked a church, so that the barely literate Father Osric celebrated Mass either inside or outside his own home, depending on the weather. The hamlet's only claim to any importance whatsoever was that it had given its name to an academy that in those days was ranked as one of the finest schools of secular learning in England, if not all Christendom. Looking back now from my doddering old age, I can appreciate how little the academy must have impressed men fresh from the king's court and the ornate cities of France. In appearance it was merely a somewhat tidier repetition of the village, except that the buildings were slightly larger, for most had 2 or even 3 rooms, and so could be glorified as cottages rather than huts. A couple had proper chimneys, which were rare back then. They were grouped around a yard and connected by a boardwalk, shaded by great elm trees. The windows were either fitted with shutters or screens of thinly shaved horn. None were glazed. This had been my home since I was barely old enough to rub down a horse or shovel out a stable. That warm afternoon both Ruffian, a stallion, and Bon Appetit, my palfrey, were saddled and tethered in the yard. They heard hooves approaching long before human ears did, and whinnied an alarm. By the time the cavalcade arrived, I was standing on the boardwalk near the entrance, leaning on my stout oaken cane, waiting for the visitors, with Edig at my side. Other men were emerging from some of the cottages, but we too were obviously the welcoming committee. There ought not to be any welcoming committee because the king's men were on a secret mission. The leading 2 horsemen rode into the yard, the rest remained outside. By then Ruffian had scented other stallions on his territory and was making enough commotion to raise the Trojan dead, screaming horse insult and doing his damnedest to pull over a 60-foot elm. The young rider in front, the one who carried the pennant, also bore a shield on his back and thus was obviously a squire. I later learned that his name was Piers. The knight he served followed a few paces behind. Both men wore swords. The knight's mount was one of the stallions that were so exasperating Ruffian, but it was kept under admirable control. The young squire eyed me in the cold way that Normans always eyed Saxons back then, and often still do. In his case, the shiny nose guard between his eyes made his stare even more menacing. "On the king's business, Sir Neil Darrell seeks adept Durwin of Helmden." I bowed, although not much. "You may inform Sir Neil that his quest is being crowned with success. This is the Academy of Helmden, and I am the man he seeks." Piers glanced around at his knight. Receiving a nod of approval, he then backed his gelding away so that the stallion could take its place. If the squire's stare had been cold, the knight's was positively icy. He was not much older than I, large and dark-complexioned, and he sported a thin moustache of the type the king did back then. That was all I could see of his person, although he was obviously well-clad and outfitted. In those days, heraldry had not achieved the complexity and importance it has reached now, so he displayed no fancy emblems. What did he see? A 22-year-old male, well-built but no giant, clean-shaven, with hair as blonde as could be, to match his Saxon name. My tunic was of good linen and well-tailored, but on my right foot I wore a boot raised about 4 inches by an iron platform. The king would not have forgotten to mention my impairment, so Sir Neil should be in no doubt that he had indeed found the man he sought.